Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you're going to learn how to accept a one-time payment using a custom form with the payment element. If you're looking for a simpler integration path, we have the no-code payment links option where you can set up a payment link directly through the dashboard and then share that with your customers through social media, email, text message, etc. Alternatively, there's another option called Stripe Checkout. This is a very simple integration that has one API call on the server. You redirect your customer to a Stripe hosted page. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about integrating the payment element. This allows you to build your own custom hosted form and collect lots of different payment method types. So the payment element supports anything from cards all the way to bank accounts. You've got support for wallets like Google Pay and Apple Pay, all the way to buy now, pay later like Affirm and Afterpay, ClearPay. So it is a great option for building your own custom form to accept a one-time payment. So just as a quick roadmap for today, we're going to install a sample, and we're going to go through the dashboard and talk about how you can enable payment methods. These are going to be those payment methods that are dynamically rendered into the payment element every time the page loads. And then we're going to create a payment intent on the server and use its client secret to render the payment element on the client so that we can collect payment details from the customer. We'll ultimately submit that payment to Stripe. And then we're going to handle any of those post-processing events. We're going to talk about webhooks and a few other considerations that you might want to think about as you're building out your integration. So let's get into it. Okay, we've got Visual Studio Code up and running here. We're going to use the Stripe for VS Code extension to install a starter template so that we don't have to start from scratch today. The Stripe for VS Code extension is available in the VS Code extension gallery. If you search for Stripe, you'll find it over there. And what we're going to do is go down here to samples, and we're going to say start with a Stripe sample. We're going to type in starter. And we're going to use the main integration with an HTML front end. And today we're going to use Ruby on the server. We'll call this new sample starter-ruby, and this is for our accept a one-time payment example. We're going to clone the sample down to our local machine, and we want to open that in the same window. Okay, so what does this sample come with when we first install it? So in the server directory, we've got some files here that are going to run on the server side. We also have some files that are going to provide a basic client using HTML and a little bit of JavaScript that we're going to write in a bit. So on the server, we also have this .env file that is pre-populated with our API keys. Because we have authenticated with the Stripe CLI, we know that the Stripe CLI is aware of what our publishable key is, and it also has this secret key that we can use to make API calls. Over in server.rb, there's a bunch of routes that are already pre-configured for us. One is for rendering back the index.html file. We've got one that's going to send back our publishable key when we make requests to /config. And we're going to actually re-implement this route for creating payment intents in just a little bit. We've also got a webhook handler that already has a scaffolded webhook handler for us, and we can add in our own handling for different webhook event types as those fire on our account. We'll come back to this in a little bit and talk about fulfillment. Before we do that though, we want to go to our dashboard and enable some payment method types. Now from the Stripe dashboard, we can head over to the settings and to the payment method settings. This is where we can manage our payment methods and enable or disable different ways that customers can pay through our payment element. So you'll see here that we have cards enabled, Link, Apple Pay, Google Pay, several different wallet methods. There's lots of different bank redirects. These are popular across Europe. We also have some buy now, pay later payment methods that are enabled. Finally, we even have ACH direct debit as one of the payment methods that customers could use. Now, if we wanted to enable Canadian pre-authorized debits, we could click turn on, and this would enable us to use Canadian pre-authorized debits as a payment method type inside of our payment flows. So this is where we manage our payment methods. And these are the payment methods that will be dynamically derived inside of our payment element when we render that and show it to customers. So that's how you enable and manage your payment methods. Instead of needing to deploy any new code, you can just come into the dashboard and enable or disable different payment method types. So this is an overview of the payment flow we're going to implement today. When the client lands on our page, we're going to make a request back to our server, which is going to make an API call to Stripe to create a payment intent. When that payment intent comes back from the API call, we're going to extract that client secret property from the payment intent. We're going to pass that to the front end so that it can be used to display and initialize the payment element. So let's jump into this now and add a new route to our server to create payment intents. Okay, so back inside of server.rb, we're going to add a new route here. called create payment intent. So we're going to say we're going to create a new post route to create payment intent. And in here, because we have the Stripe for VS Code extension installed, we can say Stripe payment intent create and hit tab, and that will show us the API call that we need to make. Now, right now, we're going to hard code $10.99. This is an integer in the smallest denomination possible for the given currency. We could also change this to euros if we wanted to. But I wanted to mention that this amount does not have to be a fixed amount. Like, you could derive that based on some product ID that was passed in. So you could use some product ID from the request to look up in the database to find out which amount you should charge if you wanted to do so. So you don't have to hard code this. There's several different currencies that you can accept. And finally, this payment method types is hard coding a list of payment method types. But instead of passing this in explicitly, because we just configured those payment methods in the dashboard, we want to enable automatic payment methods. And this will allow us to derive the payment method types that work for this given currency on the client inside of our payment element. So this call is going to give us back a payment intent. And we're going to just render the JSON for the payment intent's client secret property back to the client. So we're going to say payment intent.client secret to JSON. And this is what we're going to actually send back to the client. So let's fire up Ruby here. So we're going to change into the server directory. And we're going to say bundle install. That will install our dependencies. And now we can say Ruby server, and that will fire up our Sinatra server. So from our browser, we can now go to localhost 4242. We can see that we're successfully rendering this index page that shows this sample. Now, if we wanted to test this new endpoint, we can create a new shell session and say curl-x post to localhost 4242/create payment intent, and that will show us what we get back from the server. And that is some JSON that includes the client secret property for that payment intent. So this is the client secret property that we want to render back to the client, and we'll use that to initialize our payment element on the front end. We'll do that next. So on our client side, we want to add a form to collect payment details. So we're going to open up the index.html page and take a look at what we've got going on here. So at the top, notice that we are already installing Stripe.js from js.stripe.com. And inside of our HTML, we're just going to change this to accept a payment. And we're going to add a form here that's going to have some ID of payment form. And inside of this form, we're going to have a div with the ID of payment element. That payment element div is where we're going to mount and install the payment element using Stripe.js in just a bit. Next, we're going to add a button, and this button is just going to say pay. And finally, we'll add another div with the ID of error messages so that we can display any error messages that happen along the way. All right, now we can install a new script tag at the top of our HTML page here. This is going to go to /payment.js. Now let's create a new file called payment.js in our client directory. If we're to refresh our page right now, we're just going to see this button because our actual payment element has not loaded or been rendered onto the page. So when the DOM is fully loaded, we're going to fetch the publishable key from the server. Then we're going to create the payment intent on the server, and we're going to render payment element. So the first thing we want to do is fetch the publishable key from the server. So you could technically hard code your publishable key, but that would require that you have to update this payment.js file every single time you roll your publishable key. It's also a best practice to fetch a publishable key from the server when you're building any mobile clients with iOS, Android, React Native. And that's because oftentimes once a mobile client is installed, it's possible that instance of your code will be on someone's phone for years, and it will be really challenging to update a hard-coded publishable key. And so it is a best practice to fetch our publishable keys from the server. That's why we have this /config route that's going to return a promise that will resolve with an object that has this .json property, which returns another promise that will resolve with the actual content that we want, which is our publishable key. And we can use that to initialize a new instance of Stripe. So we're going to pass in our publishable key and we are good to go. Now, the next step is that we want to make that API call to create our payment intent. So our route on the server is called create payment intent. And this fetch call is going to accept in an options block so that we can specify that we want this to be a post request. We also want to tell it that we're going to use application JSON. So content type is application JSON. And again, this fetch call is going to return a promise that resolves with an object, and that object is going to have a JSON property or a JSON method that will again return a promise that we can await, and this is going to give us back our client secret property. Okay, so this client secret is going to be used when we initialize our elements group. So here we're going to say elements is stripe.elements. And typically, if we were building a card element integration, one of those older style integrations where we just had the card element, we would not pass any arguments into the stripe elements method here that is initializing an elements group. But when we're using the payment element, we do pass in the client secret here. And that is so that we can use the client secret property of the payment intent client side to ask Stripe what payment methods should be enabled when we render this payment method type. All right, we can also create a payment element by saying elements.create payment. And finally, we can mount this payment element onto that div that we created inside of our form. So this is the CSS selector for this div inside of our payment form. And now we should be good to go. So now when we refresh our page over here on the right-hand side, we can see that the payment element is rendered out. You'll notice that we are collecting card details here, but we can also use EPS, SurePay, lots of different payment method types, all of which we enabled from the dashboard. And these are being shown because they support euros, which is the type of currency that our payment intent was created with. All right, so now we can collect these payment details from the customer on the front end. But at this point, we're not actually handling submission of the form. So we need to handle the submission of the form and take those payment details and submit the payment to Stripe. Here we'll grab reference to that form element. And when the form is submitted, we'll prevent default for the event so that the form is not fully submitted back to the server. And then we're going to submit those payment details and submit the payment directly to Stripe using Stripe.js. So there's a method called confirm payment, and this accepts in an options block that has reference to the elements group. So that is the same as this group here that we created with Stripe elements earlier. And it also accepts in a confirm params object that has at a minimum the return URL. Now, this is the URL to which the customer will be redirected after they go through the payment flow. If you wanted to, you could disable redirection, but that will only work for some payment method types. So by setting this return URL and enabling redirection for all payment methods, this is a nice standardized flow. Here we're just going to say, let's go to window.location.href, and we're going to split on the question mark in case there was a query string value there. And then we're just going to say, come back to like complete.html or something. That's where we will redirect. Now this confirm payment method is going to return a promise, and that might resolve with an error property if there was some error submitting payment to Stripe. So if there was an error, then what we're going to do is render that out into that error messages div that we created earlier. We're going to say get element by ID error messages, and that matches our ID here for this div. And we're going to say messages.inner text is equal to error.message. Okay, now we are handling submission of our form, and we should be redirected to this complete page. So let's refresh, and we'll enter in some test card details. There is a 4242 card number. This is the default successful sort of test card number we can use. And when we click pay, we'll notice that we are redirected to complete.html. And in the query string parameter, we can see the ID of the payment intent, its client secret, and we can also see there's a redirect status here of succeeded. So we're getting an error, and that's because Sinatra doesn't know how to handle /complete.html. So we will modify that just ever so slightly. Let's make it go back to /complete, and then we'll teach Sinatra what it means to be on the complete route. And that's where we're going to handle displaying a confirmation page to the customer. All right, so back on the server, we're going to add a new route here for get to /complete. And this is the route where users are going to be redirected after they go through the payment flow. Now, when we land on this complete route, we're going to have some query string values. One of them is the ID of the payment intent. So we can actually say payment intent is Stripe payment intent.retrieve and pass in the client secret property. And we can pass in the ID of the payment intent that is available in params. So we're going to say params payment intent, and this should give us back our payment intent. For now, we'll just render the JSON back so that we can see what is available on that page. We've got to restart our server, and then we'll go through the demo one more time. All right, we're going to go through the demo one more time. We're going to enter those test card details just one more time, and then click on pay, and we're redirected back to that /complete route. And now we can see all of the JSON for our payment intent. We can see that the payment intent did succeed. But one thing you might be wondering is, should I be adding fulfillment logic in this complete route? And the answer is no. We don't want to handle any fulfillment as part of showing this completion page. It's possible the user's browser does not redirect because the internet died or their computer battery died, or for some reason they closed the browser window. So for all of those reasons, it's possible that the end customer's browser does not end up making this request to your server. So instead, it is a best practice to handle all fulfillment inside of webhooks. So we're going to take a look at our webhook handler. We're going to talk about how we're going to test our webhook integration next. So inside of our webhook handler here, this is where we're going to receive notifications from Stripe when events fire on our account. Now, the first section here is all about receiving and parsing and verifying that that event did indeed come from Stripe. And then this last bit here allows us to switch on the type of the event that we are getting notified about. So in this case, we care about the payment intent .succeeded event type. Now, when a payment intent succeeded event fires, we want to log out to the terminal that we have received a payment with this little bell notification. So in order to test and build webhook integrations, you either need to set up some tunnel using software like ngrok, or you need to have some other publicly accessible URL, like publishing your test or your dev environment to some staging server that has a publicly accessible URL. When we're in development using Stripe, we can use the Stripe for VS Code extension to forward events to some specific URL. In this case, ours is localhost 4242/webhook, and that's going to be where we want those account events forwarded when they fire on our Stripe account. So we can start up this listener, and we'll see the output down in the terminal below. It's going to show us any events that are firing. So for instance, if I refresh this page, recall that we're going to make an API call to create a payment intent. And when that happens, we get this payment intent.created event that shows up in our listen log. All right, so now that we have this event type set up, we need to restart our server. Now we're going to go back through the flow one more time and click on pay. And now we see that payment received notification bell is logged out to the terminal. So again, you want to use this webhook handler for all of your fulfillment. And the reason is that Stripe is going to retry webhooks. If for some reason your server is down, it'll retry webhooks for up to 3 days with exponential backoff. You might be wondering how to test out your integration. Well, over in the documentation for accepting a payment, you can drill down into the test integration section, and for each of the different payment method families between cards, wallets, bank redirects, etc., there are several different things that will allow you to test different scenarios. So for instance, we can grab this card, this test card that ends in 3155, and we can use that as one of our test cards inside of the payment element. And you'll notice that as we go through the payment flow here, this will trigger a secure customer authentication payment flow. So this is going to pop up a modal, and in production, this modal would contain a bank account, 2FA, or sort of like a one-time code or some way to verify that the customer is who they say they are and that they are allowed to authenticate this payment. So that's one way that you can test sort of 3D secure and secure customer authentication is with that special card number. Another thing worth noting is in the documentation, there are some optional steps depending on specific payment method types or QR code-based payment methods. These might require that you pass additional details when creating the payment intent, or they might have other considerations like with Apple Pay, you'll need to go into the dashboard and make sure that you have an Apple Pay domain set up and verified. So just to review the entire flow, the customer lands on the page and we use any information from that page to create a payment intent using the API. And then when we return that payment intent's client secret to the client, we use that to build out a payment element on our custom form. That's where customers enter their billing details, and then we can submit that payment directly to Stripe client side. And then the customer is redirected to a return URL where we display this return status or this success status, completion status. And finally, we're handling fulfillment with our webhook. That's where we're actually pulling from inventory and printing shipping labels and doing all of those things that we might do when someone buys something from us. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.